Daddy's selling me for $90,000. A black girl whispered to Mall Santa. Santa was a Hell's Angel. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The mall in Cedar Ridge was glowing with Christmas lights and cheerful music drifting through the air like warm snowflakes. Families moved through the wide corridors carrying shopping bags and cups of hot cocoa, while children laughed and pointed toward the giant decorated tree standing near the center court. The smell of cinnamon pretzels and roasted almonds floated through the air. At the heart of the crowd sat a bright red chair surrounded by sparkling garlands and wrapped gift boxes. That was where Santa Claus greeted children all afternoon. Parents lined up patiently as their kids waited for a chance to sit on Santa's lap and whisper their Christmas wishes. The man wearing the red suit looked exactly like the Santa people imagined. His beard was long and white, and his laugh was deep and warm. Most shoppers thought he was just another seasonal worker hired by the mall. But beneath the red coat and fluffy gloves was a man named Jack Callahan. Jack was not an ordinary mall Santa. Beneath the costume were powerful shoulders marked by years of riding a motorcycle across long American highways. Hidden under the sleeve of his costume was a faded tattoo that belonged to the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. Years ago, Jack had served in the United States Marine Corps. After leaving the service, he found brotherhood on the road with men who believed in loyalty above everything else. These days, he spent the holiday season volunteering as Santa for local charity events because he believed every child deserved one safe moment of joy. Late that afternoon, the line of children slowly moved forward while Christmas music played softly from speakers above the food court. A little girl stepped out of the line holding the hand of a tall man who looked impatient and distracted. The girl could not have been older than 8 years old. Her name was Naomi Carter. Her dark braids were tied with small red ribbons, but her eyes were not filled with the excitement most children carried when they approached Santa. Instead, there was something else in her face. Something quiet and frightened. When Naomi finally climbed onto Santa's lap, Jack noticed immediately that her hands were trembling. He lowered his voice gently, so only she could hear him. "What would you like for Christmas, little one?" Naomi did not smile. She leaned closer as if she was afraid someone nearby might hear her. Then in a tiny shaking voice, she whispered words that made Jack Callahan stop breathing for a moment. She said, "My daddy says he is selling me for $90,000 tonight." Jack felt the world around him suddenly go silent, even though the mall was still full of laughter and music. The little girl quickly pulled back as if she was afraid she had said something wrong. Her eyes flicked toward the crowd behind them, where the tall man who brought her stood watching with cold, impatient eyes. Jack understood instantly that the next few minutes might decide the future of this child. And the man wearing the Santa suit was no longer thinking about Christmas photos. He was thinking about protecting a little girl who had just trusted a stranger with the most terrifying secret of her life. Jack Callahan kept his arms steady as Naomi Carter sat quietly on his knee, but inside his mind something had shifted with the force of a thunderclap. Years of riding highways and surviving dangerous situations had taught him how to read people in seconds. The fear in Naomi was real. Children did not invent a sentence like the one she had whispered. Around them, the mall continued its cheerful holiday rhythm. A boy in a green sweater laughed while holding a candy cane. A mother adjusted the scarf around her daughter before taking a picture with her phone. The line for Santa slowly moved forward while the sound of Christmas music floated through the air. To anyone watching, it looked like an ordinary moment in a crowded shopping mall during the holiday season. But Jack knew something was wrong. He leaned forward slightly and spoke softly, so only Naomi could hear him. "Who told you that, sweetheart?" Naomi lowered her head and twisted the edge of her red ribbon between her fingers. Her voice was barely louder than a breath. "My daddy said it on the phone last night. He said a man is paying $90,000 and that we are driving to a motel tonight." Jack felt his jaw tighten under the fake white beard. He had heard stories like this before. In another life, during his time with the Marine Corps, he had seen the dark side of the world that most people never believed existed. Trafficking rings that treated children like property. Men who hid their crimes behind ordinary smiles and quiet neighborhoods. He forced his expression to remain warm and calm like a friendly Santa, so the watching parents would not sense anything unusual. Naomi looked toward the crowd again. Her eyes stopped on the tall man, standing near a pillar beside the toy store display. The man wore a gray jacket and kept checking his phone while glancing toward the Santa chair. Jack followed her gaze without turning his head fully. The man looked impatient and cold. The kind of man who did not belong in a place filled with laughter and children. "That your daddy over there?" Jack asked gently. Naomi nodded without lifting her eyes. "He said if I tell anyone he will be very angry." Jack rested one large gloved hand over Naomi's small shaking hands. "Listen to me very carefully," he whispered. "You did the right thing telling Santa." Naomi looked up at him for the first time with a fragile spark of hope in her eyes. "Really?" Jack nodded slowly. "Really? You are very brave." Behind them, the mall photographer cleared his throat politely. "Ready for the picture, Santa?" Jack gave his usual deep, cheerful laugh that echoed through the decorated area. "Ho ho ho, of course we are." Naomi managed a small smile for the camera, but her shoulders were still tense. The flash popped, and the moment looked perfectly normal to anyone watching. But Jack's mind was racing. He had to act carefully. If the man suspected anything, he might grab Naomi and disappear into the winter traffic outside before help could arrive. Jack lowered his voice again as Naomi slid down from his knee. "When you walk back to your daddy, I want you to keep smiling like everything is normal. Can you do that for me?" Naomi nodded slowly. Before she stepped away, Jack gently pressed a small folded piece of paper into the mitten on her hand. Inside was a simple message written quickly with a red marker from the Santa desk. "Stay close to the mall entrance. Help is coming." Naomi looked at him one more time. Jack gave her the warmest Santa smile he could manage. Then she walked back toward the tall man waiting by the pillar. Jack watched carefully as the man took Naomi's hand and began guiding her toward the main corridor of the mall. The moment they disappeared into the moving crowd, Jack Callahan stood up from the Santa chair. The laughter faded from his face. Under the red coat, his shoulders straightened like a soldier preparing for action. Somewhere out in the parking lot of Cedar Ridge Mall, his motorcycle was waiting. And more importantly, so were a few men who owed him favors. Jack quietly stepped away from the Santa set and headed toward the hallway behind the holiday display. Because the moment Naomi whispered her secret, the situation had stopped being a Christmas job. It had become a rescue mission. Jack Callahan moved quickly through the narrow hallway behind the Santa display, the cheerful sounds of the mall fading behind him as the door closed. The moment the door clicked shut, his expression changed completely. The warm smile of Santa disappeared, and the focused stare of a former Marine returned. The hallway smelled faintly of cardboard boxes and artificial pine from the holiday decorations stacked along the wall. A young employee wearing an elf costume looked up in surprise as Jack walked past. "Everything all right, Santa?" she asked. Jack gave a short nod and kept moving. "Just grabbing some water, kiddo." The employee smiled and returned to her phone without another question. Jack stepped into the small staff room behind the holiday set and quietly closed the door. The room was silent except for the low humming sound of a vending machine in the corner. Jack removed the red Santa hat and ran a hand through his short gray hair. Beneath the fluffy white sleeve of the costume, the edge of a faded tattoo appeared on his forearm. The winged skull and lettering were unmistakable. Hell's Angels. Jack pulled a worn leather phone from the pocket hidden inside the Santa coat. He stared at the screen for a second while Naomi's words echoed in his mind. $90,000. Motel tonight. Those were not the kind of words a child invented. They were the kind of words that came from something ugly and dangerous. Jack had seen that ugliness before. During his years in the Marine Corps, he had been part of operations that crossed paths with trafficking networks overseas. The faces of the victims never left him. That was why he had promised himself something a long time ago. If he ever saw something like that again, he would not walk away. Jack unlocked the phone and opened a group message thread labeled Iron Saints. It was a small group of writers who had been part of his life for many years. Men who trusted each other more than brothers. Mechanics. Veterans. Truck drivers. People who looked rough on the outside but lived by one rule. Protect the innocent. Jack typed slowly with steady fingers. Possible child trafficking situation at Cedar Ridge Mall. Black girl around 8 years old. Male guardian suspicious. Likely leaving soon. Need eyes in parking lot immediately. Within seconds the phone vibrated. The first reply came from a man named Carlos Vega. Carlos had the road name Steele and ran an auto shop 3 miles from the mall. On my way, 10 minutes. Another vibration followed. Mike Tanner, road name Bishop, retired firefighter, already nearby, watching the north parking entrance. Jack felt a small sense of relief. The brothers were responding fast. Another message appeared from a younger rider named Tyler Brooks, whose road name was Echo. Want me to call police? Jack paused before answering. Calling the police too early could make the man panic and run. If Naomi's father drove away before anyone could stop him, the girl might vanish for good. Jack typed carefully. Negative for now. We follow first. Confirm situation. Protect the kid. Jack slipped the phone back into his pocket and pulled the Santa hat back onto his head. From the outside, he still looked like a friendly mall Santa preparing for the next photo. But under the red coat, the man who walked back toward the holiday display was something very different. When Jack stepped out into the bright lights of the mall again, he immediately began scanning the crowd. Families moved through the corridors carrying shopping bags and laughing children. But he was not looking for them. His eyes were searching for one small girl with red ribbons in her braids and the tall man holding her hand. It took less than 10 seconds. Naomi and the man were walking toward the escalators that led down to the mall exit. The man looked impatient as he guided her through the crowd. Jack watched them carefully while pretending to wave at another child in line for Santa photos. Inside his mind, the plan was already forming. Outside in the cold December parking lot, the engines of several motorcycles would soon be arriving. And if the man guiding Naomi Carter thought he could quietly sell a little girl and disappear into the night, he was about to discover something very important. Some men in red suits were not just Santa Claus. Some of them were Hell's Angels. Jack Callahan kept his eyes locked on Naomi Carter and the tall man guiding her through the crowded mall corridor. The escalators hummed as shoppers moved up and down between floors carrying bright holiday bags and wrapped gifts. Christmas music floated from hidden speakers, and the smell of cinnamon pretzels drifted through the air. To everyone else, it was just another cheerful December evening. But to Jack, the entire scene had become a countdown. Naomi and the man reached the escalator and stepped on as the metal steps slowly carried them down toward the lower level where the main exit doors led to the parking lot. Jack stayed where he was for a moment, pretending to wave to a child who had just finished a Santa photo. Then he slowly stepped away from the display area and moved toward the side corridor that overlooked the escalator. He walked with the calm pace of a tired mall employee, but his eyes never left Naomi and the man. The man held Naomi's hand firmly, as if he did not want her to wander even one step away. Naomi glanced back once. Her eyes found Jack across the corridor for a brief moment. Jack gave a small reassuring nod that only she would notice. She quickly looked forward again before the man could see the exchange. Jack reached the railing above the escalator just as Naomi and the man stepped onto the ground floor. From this angle, he could watch them without being obvious. The man guided Naomi past a holiday decoration display and toward the large glass exit doors that opened into the winter evening outside. Jack felt his phone vibrate softly inside the Santa coat pocket. Without looking down, he slipped his hand inside the pocket and read the message by touch as the screen lit faintly through the fabric. Bishop here. North entrance covered. Black pickup truck waiting near row 4. Another vibration followed. Steele arriving from west side lot. 2 minutes. Jack exhaled slowly. The brothers were already moving into position. Outside the mall, the December air had begun to grow cold as evening settled across Cedar Ridge. The parking lot lights had flickered on one by one, casting pale yellow circles across rows of cars. Somewhere among those vehicles, Naomi's father was planning to drive away with her. Jack watched as the man pushed open the glass doors and stepped outside with Naomi beside him. The automatic doors closed behind them, and for a moment the noise of the mall softened again. Jack turned calmly and walked toward the hallway that led to the employee exit. He passed a security guard standing near the information desk. Evening, Santa, the guard said with a friendly smile. Busy night. Jack nodded politely while continuing past him. Sure is. The guard returned to his conversation with a nearby shopper without another thought. Jack pushed open the employee exit door and stepped into the cold night air behind the mall building. The cheerful glow of holiday decorations faded instantly behind him. Outside, the world felt darker and quieter. Snow from a storm earlier in the week still rested along the edges of the pavement. Jack walked across the back service lane toward the front parking lot while removing the red Santa gloves. The cold air hit his hands, but he barely noticed. His focus was locked on the front entrance area where Naomi and the man would appear at any second. The distant rumble of a motorcycle engine echoed faintly somewhere across the lot. Then another. Jack knew those sounds well. Those engines belonged to men who had answered his call without hesitation. Moments later, Naomi and the man stepped out of the front entrance doors and walked toward a dark sedan parked near the outer row of vehicles. The man opened the passenger side door and motioned for Naomi to climb inside. Naomi hesitated for a brief second before slowly stepping into the car. The man shut the door and walked around the front of the vehicle toward the driver's seat. Jack stood near the shadow of a parked delivery truck, watching the scene carefully. Across the lot, a black pickup truck engine quietly started. At the far end, two motorcycles rolled slowly between the rows of cars, their headlights dim but steady. Jack adjusted the Santa coat around his shoulders and stepped forward from the shadows. Because the moment the sedan engine started and those headlights pointed toward the exit road, this quiet parking lot was about to become the center of a very serious problem for the man who thought he could disappear with Naomi Carter. The engine of the dark sedan started with a low vibration that rolled through the cold air of the Cedar Ridge Mall parking lot. White clouds of exhaust drifted from the tailpipe as the man settled into the driver's seat and adjusted his mirrors. Naomi Carter sat quietly in the passenger seat with both hands folded tightly in her lap. The small folded piece of paper from Santa was still hidden inside her mitten. Her heart beat fast in her chest, but she remembered exactly what Santa had told her. Stay calm. Stay close to the entrance. Help is coming. She kept her eyes down as the man beside her checked his phone again. His name was Derek Sloan, and impatience was written all over his face. He tapped the steering wheel with his fingers while glancing toward the mall entrance, and then toward the parking lot road that led to the highway. Naomi had learned long ago that when Derek became quiet like this, it meant he was thinking about something serious. Outside the car, the cold evening air carried the faint rumble of distant motorcycle engines moving slowly through the rows of parked vehicles. Derek did not notice. He was busy scrolling through messages on his phone. Naomi stared through the windshield at the glowing entrance doors of the mall. Behind those doors were families laughing and drinking hot chocolate, and children holding new toys. For a moment she wished she could run back inside and disappear into that warm, safe world. But the car doors were locked, and Derek had already shifted the car into drive. Across the parking lot, Jack Callahan stepped forward from the shadow beside the delivery truck. The red Santa coat fluttered slightly in the winter breeze as he walked toward the center row of vehicles. His eyes remained locked on the dark sedan where Naomi sat. Another deep rumble echoed through the lot, and a black pickup truck slowly rolled forward from a parking space near the north entrance. Inside the truck sat Mike Tanner, known to the brothers as Bishop. The retired firefighter leaned one arm casually out the driver window while watching the sedan with calm focus. At the far end of the lot, a motorcycle turned the corner between two rows of cars and glided slowly forward. The rider wore a dark helmet and a leather jacket that reflected the glow of the parking lot lights. That was Carlos Vega, known on the road as Steel. A second motorcycle followed behind him with a younger rider named Tyler Brooks, who the club called Echo. None of them rushed. None of them made sudden moves. To anyone watching, it would look like a few riders simply arriving at the mall during the holiday season. But Jack knew exactly what was happening. The brothers were forming a quiet circle around the sedan. Derek Sloan pressed the gas pedal, and the sedan began moving slowly toward the exit lane that led to the road. The moment the car rolled forward, the black pickup truck pulled out from its parking space and moved into the same lane several car lengths ahead of the sedan. Derek frowned slightly, but kept driving. Meanwhile, the two motorcycles cruised into the lane behind the sedan at a relaxed pace. The low rumble of their engines filled the cold night air. Derek glanced into his rearview mirror, and his frown deepened. Something about the parking lot traffic suddenly felt strange. Naomi noticed it too. Through the side window, she saw a man in a red Santa coat walking calmly between the rows of vehicles not far from the car. Even from a distance, she recognized the broad shoulders and steady stride. Santa. Jack kept walking without looking directly at the sedan as it rolled closer to the exit lane. His hand slipped into the pocket of the Santa coat where his phone rested. The screen lit up with a message from Bishop. North exit blocked. Your move. Jack looked up just as the sedan reached the end of the row where The parking lot exit opened toward the street. Instead of an open road, Derek saw the black pickup truck sitting sideways in the lane ahead. The brake lights of the sedan glowed red as Derek slammed his foot onto the pedal. The motorcycles behind him rolled closer until their headlights filled his rearview mirror. Derek looked around the parking lot with growing confusion and anger. And that was the moment Jack Callahan stepped directly into the beam of the sedan headlights wearing a Santa suit and a calm expression that told Derek Sloan one very important thing. The man standing in front of the car was not moving. The bright headlights of the sedan washed across the red Santa coat as Jack Callahan stood calmly in the middle of the exit lane. The cold night air carried the deep rumble of motorcycle engines and the quiet hum of the sedan idling only a few yards away from him. Derek Sloan stared through the windshield in disbelief. For a moment, he thought the man in the Santa suit would step aside like any normal person would when a car approached. But Jack did not move even an inch. Derek leaned forward over the steering wheel and shouted through the glass, "Hey, move out of the way." The words came sharp and irritated. Jack simply raised one gloved hand slowly in a calm gesture that told Derek to wait. The gesture was not aggressive. It was not threatening. But it was firm in a way that made Derek hesitate. Naomi Carter sat frozen in the passenger seat. Her heart pounded so loudly she could almost hear it in her ears. Through the windshield, she could see the red coat and the white beard clearly now. Santa. But the way he stood there was different from before. He looked taller somehow. Stronger. The gentle laugh she heard inside the mall was gone. In its place was the quiet confidence of someone who was not afraid of the car in front of him. Derek slammed his palm against the steering wheel in frustration. What is this, some kind of joke? He quickly checked the mirrors again, and his irritation turned into something colder. Behind the sedan, the two motorcycles had rolled closer and now stopped only a short distance away. Their headlights filled the rear window with bright white light. The riders sat still, on their bikes like silent statues. Derek turned his attention forward again and saw that the black pickup truck ahead had not moved either. It sat sideways across the lane, blocking the exit completely. Derek muttered under his breath and shifted the car into reverse for a moment before stopping again. There was no room to turn around with the motorcycles behind him and the rows of parked cars on both sides. The situation had quietly turned into a trap. Outside the car, Jack took a slow step forward until the headlights illuminated his face more clearly. His eyes were steady and calm. He reached up with one hand and slowly removed the red Santa hat from his head. The white beard still covered his face, but the gesture alone was enough to tell Derek this was no ordinary mall worker. Jack spoke through the closed windshield in a voice that was calm, but firm enough for Derek to read his lips. "Turn off the engine." Derek stared at him with growing anger. "You better move out of my way, old man." Jack did not react to the insult. Instead, he walked to the front corner of the sedan and gently tapped the hood with his gloved knuckles, as if he was checking the temperature of the metal. Then he looked directly at Naomi through the passenger window. Naomi felt a small wave of relief pass through her chest. Jack gave her a small nod that meant the same thing it had meant earlier inside the mall. "You are not alone." Derek noticed the exchange, and his eyes narrowed immediately. He leaned toward Naomi. "You know this guy?" Naomi shook her head quickly and looked down at her hands. Derek opened the driver door suddenly and stepped out into the cold air. The moment his feet touched the pavement, the sound of motorcycle engines behind him grew slightly louder as steel and Echo slowly rolled their bikes forward another few feet. Derek glanced over his shoulder and finally saw the leather jackets and dark helmets clearly under the parking lot lights. He turned back toward Jack with suspicion written across his face. "What is this supposed to be? Some kind of stunt?" Jack lowered his voice slightly as he spoke. "It is simple. You are not leaving with that girl tonight." Derek laughed once, but there was no humor in it. "And who exactly are you to stop me?" Jack slowly reached up and pulled the white beard down just enough for Derek to see the lower half of his face. The parking lot lights revealed a weathered jaw and the faint edge of a tattoo near his collar. "My name is Jack Callahan," he said calmly. "And you picked the wrong night to try something like this." Behind Derek, the rumble of motorcycles deepened as the riders waited quietly for whatever happened next. The cold wind moved quietly through the Cedar Ridge Mall parking lot as the tension between the two men thickened in the pale yellow glow of the overhead lights. Jack Callahan stood in front of the sedan with calm, steady eyes, while Derek Sloan remained beside the open driver door, staring at him with growing anger. The rumble of motorcycle engines behind Derek continued like distant thunder, low and controlled, but powerful enough to remind everyone that the situation was no longer simple. Derek crossed his arms and took a slow step forward. I do not know who you think you are, Jack, but you have no idea what you are getting involved in tonight. His voice carried irritation, but beneath it there was something else now. Unease. Jack did not raise his voice, and he did not step back. His posture stayed relaxed yet firm, as if he had planted himself into the pavement. I know enough, he said calmly. I know a little girl told me something inside that mall that should never come out of a child's mouth. Derek gave a sharp laugh that echoed across the quiet lot. You are listening to some kid story and making a scene in the middle of a parking lot. That is real smart, Santa. Jack slowly reached up and pulled the fake white beard down completely, now letting it hang loose against his chest. The action revealed the weathered face of a man who had spent many years in places far more dangerous than a shopping mall parking lot. The faint outline of a tattoo crept above the collar of his shirt and disappeared under the red Santa coat. Derek noticed it immediately. The symbol was not something most people misunderstood. His eyes narrowed as he studied Jack more carefully. So that is what this is, he muttered. Some kind of biker game. Behind Derek, the motorcycles shut off their engines one by one, leaving a heavy silence hanging in the cold air. Steele swung his leg off his bike and stood beside it while Echo removed his helmet, slowly revealing a young face that was serious and focused. Across the lane, the black pickup truck door opened, and Bishop stepped out, adjusting his jacket as he walked toward the group with calm, steady steps. Derek looked around as the realization finally reached him. This was not a random interruption. These men had surrounded him deliberately. Inside the sedan, Naomi Carter watched through the window with wide eyes. She could see the silhouettes of the riders now standing beside their motorcycles under the parking lot lights. They looked big and quiet and strangely calm. It did not feel like the angry shouting she sometimes heard at home. It felt different, like a wall slowly forming between her and something dangerous. Derek pointed a finger toward Jack. You think you can just trap someone in a parking lot because of some stupid story? Jack folded his arms slowly across his chest. You are not trapped, Derek. You can walk away anytime you want. Just leave the girl here and drive off alone. Derek's expression darkened immediately. Not happening. That is my kid. Jack's eyes stayed locked on him. Then why is she afraid of you? The question landed like a heavy stone in the quiet lot. Derek opened his mouth to answer, but stopped. For the first time, he glanced toward the passenger seat, where Naomi sat with her head lowered. He turned back toward Jack quickly. That is none of your business. Jack took one slow step closer. When a child whispers something like that to a stranger, it becomes everybody's business. Steele spoke quietly from behind Derek, his deep voice cutting through the silence. You should listen to him, friend. Derek spun around angrily. Stay out of this. Bishop stepped forward next, stopping beside Jack. Too late for that, he said calmly. Derek looked from one man to the next and realized something that made his pulse begin to race. None of them looked nervous. None of them looked unsure. They stood with the quiet confidence of men who had already decided how this night would end. Jack finally spoke again, his voice steady and clear. Derek, the only question left now is whether you make this easy or very difficult for yourself. The cold air hung still for a moment as the choice settled between them. The silence in the Cedar Ridge Mall parking lot stretched for several seconds after Jack Callahan asked his final question. The pale yellow lights above them buzzed faintly while a cold wind moved between the rows of parked cars. Derek Sloan stood beside the open driver door of the sedan with tension tightening across his face. His eyes moved from Jack to the man behind him and back again as he tried to understand how the situation had turned so quickly against him. Naomi Carter watched everything through the passenger window. Her small hands remained folded in her lap, but her eyes followed every movement outside the car. For the first time that night, she felt something she had not felt in a long time. Hope. Derek suddenly let out a harsh laugh that sounded forced. This is ridiculous, he said loudly. You people are standing around in a parking lot acting like you are heroes in some movie. Jack remained completely still. Nobody here is acting, Derek. Derek pointed toward the sedan. That girl is my responsibility, and you have no right to interfere. Bishop folded his arms as he stood beside Jack and studied Derek quietly. Funny thing about responsibility, he said calmly. Most responsible fathers do not look like they are trying to rush a child out of town at night. Derek's face hardened immediately. Watch what you say, old man. Steele shifted his weight beside his motorcycle, but his voice stayed calm. You should take the advice Jack gave you earlier. Leave the girl and drive away. Derek shook his head and stepped closer to Jack until only a few feet separated them. You really think I am just going to hand her over to a group of bikers dressed like mall Santas? Jack did not react to the sarcasm. Instead, he spoke in the same steady tone he had used since the beginning. Nobody said you had to hand her over to us. But you are not leaving with her tonight. Derek stared at him for a moment, then turned his head toward the sedan where Naomi sat. Naomi saw his eyes and quickly looked down again. Derek exhaled slowly and ran one hand through his hair as if thinking through his options. The parking lot remained quiet around them, but in the distance a few shoppers were walking toward their cars carrying holiday bags and talking about dinner plans. None of them realized the situation unfolding only a few rows away. Derek turned back toward Jack. You do not understand what is going on, he said quietly now. Jack tilted his head slightly. Then explain it. Derek hesitated. His eyes flicked briefly toward the dark road beyond the parking lot exit, as if expecting someone else to arrive. That small movement did not go unnoticed by the men around him. Bishop leaned slightly toward Jack and spoke under his breath. He is waiting for someone. Jack gave the smallest nod in response. Derek finally spoke again, but his voice sounded more strained than before. I made a deal, and people do not like it when deals fall apart. Steele raised one eyebrow. That sounds like a you problem. Derek shot him an angry look, but quickly returned his attention to Jack. You have no idea who you are interfering with. Jack answered calmly. Maybe not. But I know exactly what happens when grown men treat children like merchandise. The words hung heavy in the cold air. Derek's expression shifted slightly when he realized Jack had guessed more than he expected. Inside the sedan, Naomi lifted her head slowly and looked out the window again. The men outside stood in a quiet half circle around the car like a barrier she could not have imagined only an hour earlier. Derek noticed her looking, and his jaw tightened. He suddenly turned back toward the driver door as if preparing to get back into the car. Jack took one step closer, blocking the door without raising his voice. That would not be a smart decision. Derek stopped halfway through the motion. His eyes darted toward the motorcycles behind him again, then toward the pickup truck still blocking the exit lane. The realization was unavoidable now. He was surrounded. Jack spoke once more, but this time there was a quiet edge beneath the calm tone. Whoever you were planning to meet tonight is not getting that girl. Derek stared at him silently for several seconds. Then from somewhere beyond the far end of the parking lot a pair of headlights appeared, turning slowly into the entrance road. The bright beams cut across the dark pavement. As a large black sport utility vehicle rolled toward them, Bishop looked toward the approaching vehicle and spoke quietly. I think the rest of your story just arrived. The bright headlights of the approaching sport utility vehicle washed across the parking lot as the large black vehicle rolled slowly toward the blocked exit lane. The beam of light stretched across the pavement and reflected off the chrome of the motorcycles and the glossy paint of the sedan where Naomi Carter sat quietly in the passenger seat. The rumble of the sport utility vehicle engine grew louder as it moved closer. Derek Sloan watched it with a mixture of tension and relief spreading across his face. Jack Callahan noticed the change immediately. Derek straightened his posture slightly and folded his arms as if he suddenly believed the balance of power was shifting. The vehicle slowed and turned into the same row where the confrontation was unfolding. Its headlights illuminated the group clearly now. The motorcycles. The black pickup truck blocking the exit. The man in the red Santa coat standing in front of the sedan. Inside the sedan, Naomi felt her stomach tighten again as the vehicle approached. She could see the reflection of its lights on the windshield and the shape of two dark figures inside the front seats. Derek gave a short laugh under his breath. Looks like my ride just showed up, he said quietly. Jack did not move from his position near the front of the sedan. His eyes followed the approaching vehicle calmly. Bishop glanced toward the sport utility vehicle and spoke softly. Looks like two men in there. Steele shifted slightly beside his motorcycle while Echo crossed his arms watching the scene with quiet focus. The sport utility vehicle rolled forward until it stopped a few yards away from the sedan. The engine remained running, and for several seconds nobody inside the vehicle moved. The headlights continued shining directly into the parking lot lane, casting long shadows behind the men standing there. Then the driver door opened slowly. A tall man stepped out first wearing a dark jacket and a heavy gold chain around his neck. His expression carried the casual confidence of someone who believed he controlled the situation. The passenger door opened a moment later, and another man climbed out. This one was broader with thick shoulders and a shaved head. Both men looked toward Derek first. Derek lifted his chin slightly. "You boys took your time," he said loudly enough for them to hear. The tall man with the gold chain glanced around the scene and immediately noticed the motorcycles and the pickup truck blocking the lane. His confident expression faded slightly. "What is all this?" he asked. Derek gestured toward Jack with irritation. "Some biker clown decided to play hero tonight." Jack remained calm as the two newcomers studied him. The man with the shaved head stepped forward a few feet, squinting at the red Santa coat, and then at the men behind Jack. His eyes lingered on the motorcycles and the leather jackets. Something about the situation clearly made him cautious. Steele spoke quietly to Bishop beside him. They were not expecting this. Jack finally addressed the newcomers. "Evening, gentlemen," he said calmly. "You arrived just in time to turn around and leave." The tall man with the gold chain laughed once, but it sounded uncertain. "And who exactly are you supposed to be?" Jack did not raise his voice. "Just someone making sure that little girl stays right where she belongs tonight." The tall man glanced toward the sedan and saw Naomi sitting inside through the windshield. His expression changed quickly, and he turned back toward Derek. "You said this would be simple," he muttered. Derek shrugged angrily. "It was until Santa Claus here decided to get involved." The man with the shaved head stepped closer, now looking directly at Jack. "Listen, friend, this does not concern you." Jack answered calmly. "It concerns me the moment a child asks for help." The two men exchanged a quick glance with each other. Behind them, the engine of the sport utility vehicle continued idling quietly. Bishop leaned toward Jack and spoke under his breath. "Should we call it in now?" Jack kept his eyes on the two men standing beside Derek. "Not yet," he said softly. The cold wind moved through the parking lot again as the tension thickened. Derek stood between the newcomers and the bikers with growing impatience. The tall man with the gold chain finally spoke again. "Let us keep this simple," he said. "Derek gets in the car with the girl, and we leave. Nobody gets hurt." Steele let out a slow breath beside his motorcycle. Jack looked at the man calmly for a long moment before answering. "That is not how this ends tonight." The cold night air in the Cedar Ridge Mall parking lot felt heavier now as the two men who arrived in the black sport utility vehicle stood beside Derek Sloan, facing the small group of bikers. The headlights from the vehicle cast long shadows across the pavement and reflected off the chrome of the motorcycles parked behind Jack Callahan. The engine of the sport utility vehicle continued to idle with a low, steady growl that echoed through the otherwise quiet lot. Jack stood calm and unmoving in his red Santa coat, while the man with the gold chain studied him carefully. The confidence that man carried when he stepped out of the vehicle had begun to fade. It was clear he had expected a quiet exchange and a fast departure. Instead, he found himself facing several men who looked like they had no intention of stepping aside. Derek Sloan stepped closer to the man with the gold chain and lowered his voice slightly, though everyone nearby could still hear him. "You said this would be quick," he muttered. The tall man gave Derek a sharp look. "It would have been quick if you kept control of the situation." Derek pointed angrily toward Jack. "That is the problem right there." Jack watched the exchange quietly. Years earlier, he had learned that men who planned illegal deals often turned on each other the moment things stopped going smoothly. Steele leaned casually against his motorcycle, while Echo stood a few feet behind him with his arms crossed. Bishop remained near the pickup truck that blocked the exit lane with a calm, steady expression on his face. The tall man with the gold chain took a slow step forward and spoke toward Jack again. "You still have time to walk away from this," he said. Jack answered calmly without raising his voice. "And you still have time to leave without making things worse for yourself." The man with the shaved head shifted his weight and looked toward the sedan where Naomi Carter still sat inside. Her small figure was barely visible behind the glass, but the presence of a child made the tension in the scene impossible to ignore. The shaved-head man leaned toward Derek and spoke quietly, though Jack could still hear him. "Are you sure about this girl?" Derek's jaw tightened. "She is worth the money." Those words hung in the cold air for a moment, and even the man with the gold chain looked uncomfortable hearing them spoken so openly. Jack felt his chest tighten slightly, but his voice remained steady. "That sentence alone tells me everything I need to know," he said. Derek rolled his eyes with frustration. Do not act like you are some kind of Saint Santa. You have no idea what people will do for money. Jack took one slow step closer until he stood only a few feet away from Derek. Maybe not, he said quietly. But I know exactly what happens when someone crosses a line like this. Bishop finally spoke from beside the pickup truck. Police are about 15 minutes away if you want me to make the call now. The tall man with the gold chain immediately looked toward Derek with concern. You said nobody called anyone. Derek shook his head quickly. Nobody did. Jack looked toward Bishop and gave a small nod. Make the call. Bishop pulled his phone from his jacket pocket and stepped a few feet away as he began dialing. The moment Derek realized the police were about to become involved, his attitude shifted again. He looked toward the two men beside the sport utility vehicle. This is getting out of control, he said. The tall man ran a hand across his face, thinking quickly. The plan had clearly collapsed and the risk was growing by the second. Steele spoke calmly from beside his motorcycle. Gentlemen, you should take this moment to make a smart decision. Derek looked toward the sedan again, where Naomi sat waiting silently. His eyes darted toward the open road beyond the parking lot, as if calculating how quickly he could escape. Jack watched him closely and spoke with quiet certainty. You are not driving anywhere tonight, Derek. Not with that girl in the car. The sound of Bishop speaking to the emergency operator carried faintly through the cold air, while the tension around the vehicles tightened even further. The tall man with the gold chain finally looked back at Derek and said something under his breath that Jack could not hear clearly, but the meaning was obvious. The deal was falling apart, and now every second brought the risk of flashing police lights rolling into the parking lot. Derek clenched his fists as the reality of the situation finally settled around him. The cold night air in the Cedar Ridge Mall parking lot felt even heavier after Bishop finished speaking to the emergency operator. His voice had been calm and clear as he reported a suspected child trafficking situation and gave the exact location. When he ended the call, he placed the phone back in his jacket pocket and looked toward Jack Callahan. They are on the way, he said quietly. The words settled over the group like a slow rolling storm. Derek Sloan heard them clearly, and his face tightened with anger and fear at the same time. He ran a hand across his mouth and looked again toward the sedan where Naomi Carter sat waiting silently in the passenger seat. The glow of the parking lot lights reflected softly off the windshield, and the small shape of the child inside made the entire scene feel even more serious. The tall man with the gold chain stepped closer to Derek and lowered his voice. This deal is finished, he said. We are leaving. Derek turned sharply toward him. You cannot just walk away, he snapped. The man shook his head slowly. When police show up, everything changes. I am not going down for this. The shaved-head man beside him nodded in agreement and took a step back toward the sport utility vehicle. Derek looked from one man to the other with disbelief. You promised me this was safe, he said angrily. The tall man gave him a cold look. You promised me nobody would interfere. Jack watched the argument unfold without speaking. His eyes remained calm, but alert as he studied Derek's movements. Years of experience had taught him that desperate men often made reckless choices when they realized their plans had collapsed. Steele noticed the same thing and shifted his stance slightly beside his motorcycle. Echo moved a few steps closer to the sedan without drawing attention to himself, while Bishop remained near the pickup truck blocking the exit lane. Derek finally turned back toward Jack with frustration burning in his eyes. This is your fault, he said sharply. Jack did not respond to the accusation. Instead, he spoke quietly but firmly. The only thing that matters now is that the girl is safe. Derek laughed bitterly. Safe from what, he said. She is my responsibility. Jack shook his head slowly. Hey, man who tries to sell a child loses the right to talk about responsibility. Those words hit Derek harder than any shouted insult could have. For a moment, he stood frozen between anger and fear. Then his attention shifted suddenly toward the sedan again. Naomi noticed him looking, and her hands tightened slightly in her lap. Derek walked quickly toward the driver's side door, as if making a final decision. Jack moved immediately, stepping between Derek and the car before he could reach the handle. Do not do that, Derek, he said calmly. Derek stopped only a foot away from him. You cannot stop me forever, he replied through clenched teeth. Jack's voice remained steady. I do not have to stop you forever, just long enough. In the distance, the faint sound of a siren began to echo through the cold night air. At first it was barely noticeable, but within seconds the sound grew clearer as it approached from the direction of the main road. The tall man with the gold chain heard it, and immediately turned toward the sport utility vehicle. "That is our signal," he muttered to the shaved-head man. Without another word, the two of them walked quickly back to their vehicle and climbed inside. The engine revved slightly as they prepared to leave. Derek watched them in disbelief as the sport utility vehicle turned around and drove toward the opposite end of the parking lot. The deal he had arranged was gone. The men who promised easy money had vanished the moment trouble appeared. Now he stood alone facing Jack and the bikers while the sound of approaching sirens grew louder with every passing second. Jack looked toward the road where flashing red and blue lights were beginning to appear in the distance, and then back at Derek. "The night is almost over," he said quietly. The distant sound of police sirens grew louder with every passing second, echoing through the Cedar Ridge Mall parking lot and bouncing off the rows of parked cars. Red and blue lights began flashing faintly on the horizon near the entrance road as the patrol vehicles approached. Derek Sloan stood frozen beside the sedan as the reality of the situation closed around him. The men who had promised him money were gone. The road was blocked, and the law was on its way. Jack Callahan remained calm where he stood, only a few feet from Derek and the driver's side door. The red Santa coat moved slightly in the cold wind, while the loose white beard rested against his chest. Around him, Steele, Echo, and Bishop maintained their quiet positions like a silent barrier around the car. None of them spoke. None of them needed to. Derek ran both hands through his hair in frustration and took a slow step back away from the sedan. "This is insane," he muttered under his breath. "You people have no idea what you just ruined." Jack watched him carefully and replied in the same steady voice he had used since the beginning of the confrontation. "What was ruined tonight was a bad decision that should never have been made." Derek looked toward the sedan again, where Naomi Carter still sat inside the passenger seat. Through the windshield, she could see the flashing police lights reflecting faintly in the distance, and the calm figures of the bikers standing between her and the man who had frightened her for so long. Jack turned slightly toward the car and gently tapped the passenger window with one gloved hand. Naomi looked up and slowly unlocked the door from inside. The door opened quietly, and she stepped out into the cold night air. The moment her feet touched the pavement, Jack lowered himself slightly, so he was closer to her height. "You are safe now," he said softly. Naomi looked at him for a moment and then nodded slowly. She moved closer to him, instinctively standing beside the red coat, as if it were a shield. Derek watched the moment with a mixture of anger and defeat. "You think you are some kind of hero," he said bitterly. Jack shook his head once. "No, just someone who listened when a child asked for help." The approaching sirens were loud now, and the first patrol car turned into the parking lot in trance with its lights flashing brightly. Another vehicle followed closely behind it. The blue and red reflections spread across the pavement and the sides of the parked cars as the officers drove toward the group. Derek stood silently as the patrol cars stopped nearby, and two officers stepped out quickly. One of them looked around the scene and spoke firmly. "Everyone stay where you are." Jack raised both hands slightly in a calm gesture. "Officers, we called this in possible child trafficking situation," he said clearly. Bishop stepped forward and confirmed the report while pointing toward Derek and the sedan. The officers exchanged quick glances, and one of them approached Derek while the other moved toward Jack and Naomi. The officer nearest Derek spoke in a firm voice. "Sir, we need you to place your hands where we can see them." Derek looked around the parking lot one last time, as if hoping for some way out. But there was none. Slowly he raised his hands, and the officer guided him toward the patrol car. Meanwhile, the second officer knelt slightly, so he could speak gently to Naomi. "Are you all right, sweetheart?" he asked. Naomi nodded again, though her voice remained quiet. "Yes, sir." The officer looked toward Jack briefly, and then back at Naomi. "You did the right thing telling someone." Jack stood quietly beside her while the officers began securing the scene and speaking into their radios. The long, tense night that had started with a frightened whisper inside a crowded mall was finally coming to an end under the flashing lights of the police cars. The flashing red and blue lights from the police vehicles painted the Cedar Ridge Mall parking lot in waves of color as the officers continued securing the scene. The cold night air felt calmer now that the tension had broken. Derek Sloan stood beside the patrol car with his hands behind his back, while an officer read him his rights in a firm, steady voice. The anger that had filled his face earlier was gone now, replaced by a dull expression of defeat. A few yards away, Naomi Carter stood quietly beside Jack Callahan near the front of the sedan. The officer who had spoken with her earlier knelt again, so he could look at her at eye level. "You were very brave tonight," he said gently. Naomi nodded slowly, but her eyes stayed on Jack. For a moment, the noise of police radios and idling engines faded into the background. All she could see was the tall man in the red Santa coat who had listened when nobody else had. Jack rested one hand lightly on her shoulder in a reassuring way. "You did the hardest part," he said softly. "You asked for help. That takes courage." Naomi looked up at him and finally spoke again. In a small, steady voice. "I knew Santa would help me." Jack smiled quietly at that. Around them, the officers began taking statements from Bishop, Steele, and Echo. The bikers answered calmly, explaining how the situation had started inside the mall and how Naomi had whispered to Santa that she was afraid. The officer writing the report nodded several times as he listened carefully. After a few minutes, he walked over to Jack. "Sir, we will need your full statement as well, but I want you to know you and your friends did the right thing tonight. Situations like this can turn dangerous very quickly, and your actions probably prevented something terrible." Jack gave a small nod. "Just glad we were in the right place at the right time." The officer looked toward Naomi and then back at Jack. "Child Services will make sure she is safe while everything is sorted out. She will not be going back with him tonight." Naomi heard those words, and the tension she had been carrying for so long finally eased from her shoulders. She stepped a little closer to Jack and held the edge of his red coat, as if she still needed reassurance that this was real. Jack looked down and smiled gently. The officer spoke softly again. "We have a social worker on the way to take care of her tonight." Jack nodded in understanding. Not far away, the patrol car door closed as Derek Sloan was placed in the back seat. The flashing lights continued to reflect across the pavement, but the danger that had filled the night was gone. A few shoppers in the distance were beginning to notice the police activity, but the situation itself was already under control. Steele and Echo walked over toward Jack after finishing their statements. Steele glanced down at Naomi and gave a small respectful nod. "Looks like you picked the right Santa tonight, kid." Naomi gave a shy smile in return. Echo laughed quietly. "Not every Santa has a motorcycle crew watching his back." Jack shook his head slightly at that, but the corner of his mouth lifted in a small smile. A few minutes later, another car arrived, and a woman stepped out carrying a warm blanket. She introduced herself as the social worker who would stay with Naomi for the evening. She wrapped the blanket gently around Naomi's shoulders and spoke kindly to her while explaining what would happen next. Naomi listened quietly, then turned back to Jack one last time. "Thank you," she said softly. Jack adjusted the Santa hat on his head and gave her the same warm smile he had given hundreds of children earlier that day. "You take care of yourself, Naomi. Christmas still has a way of finding people who deserve it." Naomi nodded and walked with the social worker toward the waiting car while the flashing lights continued to glow across the parking lot. Jack watched until she was safely inside the vehicle. Then he turned back toward his friends and the row of motorcycles waiting under the cold winter sky. The Santa suit might have fooled the crowd inside the mall, but tonight it had been something more than a costume. It had been a promise that when a child whispered for help, someone would always be listening.